I am thrilled to be here today with organizer and political strategist Alicia Garza. Alicia is principal of the Black Futures Lab, co-creator of the hashtag Black Lives Matter, and a co-founder of the Black Lives Matter Global Network. She is also host of the podcast Lady Don't Take No. That's why I do this and I don't sing. But the podcast is Lady Don't Take No. Alicia has recently added the title author to her proverbial belt with the 2020 publication of her book, The Purpose of Power: How We Come Together When We Fall Apart. Thank you, Alicia, and welcome. I am so glad that you're here with us today. To celebrate, yes, it's 25 years of inspiring people to build a better world. But before we dive in, I want to read some of what I think is one of the most aptly written testimonials about your book. And it captures the book's essence and content, I think. I thought about reading a piece from the book, but then I didn't want to spoil it for everybody who hasn't gotten it yet because we have a surprising 40% discount. So y'all need to go ahead and pick this up and take advantage of that. So that's my plug for the book. But I do want to read this testimonial from writer, political commentator, and professor of politics, Melissa Harris Perry. She says, in this magnificent and engaging text, Alicia Garza deftly combines revealing personal memoir, thorough social history, astute political theory, and pragmatic strategic advice. Through this exquisite narrative, Garza shows why she is a singular figure of her generation, a generation about which everyone is convinced, she writes, that there was something inherently wrong with us. Combining personal and national history, Garza reveals all that is right with a generation forged in the fire of the Clinton-era carceral state and coming of age in the era of Obama-enforced respectability. Refusing to romanticize any moment or movement, Garza explains both the why and the how of meaningful, impactful organizing for and with Black communities. Never cruel, but unflinchingly honest, Garza analyzes the external and internal opponents that have marked Black people's long struggle for justice in this country. She teaches clearly, corrects lovingly, demands boldly, and proceeds fearlessly to fight for the lives of all Black people. This is a text everyone needs to read, to discuss, to debate, to challenge, and to absorb. Alicia is our Ella Baker. Wow. What a tribute and a well-earned praise for such a commanding and timely piece of work. Thank you again, Alicia, for being here. We have maybe a little under 45 minutes at this time. So you and I are going to chat for a bit, and then we'll take the remaining of our time for you to respond to questions from those joining us today.
Awesome.
Okay.
Well,
So let's get it.
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. Let's go ahead and discuss and absorb.
Let's do it.
All right. In the opening of your book, you write that when you began, you thought that you'd be writing about the story of Black Lives Matter, right? But what came about was your own personal journey, right? And so I think it's fair to say that what's in the purpose of power is not only what you've learned since Black Lives Matter and what has become a global movement, but your more than 20 years of organizing and movement building. What are some of those lessons, and why was it important for you to write this book at this time?
Well, again, thank you so much for having me, and hi to everybody who's watching right now. Thanks for joining us. You know, when I started to write this book, I thought it was going to be a completely different book. I thought it might be helpful to kind of write down all of the things that we'd ever been asked about Black Lives Matter. How do you turn a hashtag into a movement? You know, is it Black Lives Matter or All Lives Matter? But that's not the book that came out when I sat down to start writing. And in fact, a lot of what came out were stories about my mother. And in reflecting upon that, what I learned is that, you know, my mom was so instrumental for me in helping to shape my view of the world, who I thought belonged and didn't belong, and what I think needs to happen in order to make the world a better place. And as I was reflecting and writing, I realized that that was actually the book that we needed. We needed a book that could, sorry, this is a Zoom thing and there's somebody at my door. We needed a book that could be a roadmap, like the roadmap, thank you, that I never got as an organizer. And I feel like part of what we grapple with, especially in this moment of increased activism, increased engagement, and sharpening crisis, is that there are more people than ever now who are tuned into how the world needs to change. But a lot of us don't have answers about where we start, what our contribution can be, what our role can be. And I wanted this book to be a roadmap. I wanted it to be the book that I didn't have when I first started organizing, but the book that I needed. I needed a book that could talk to me about in real time what was movement building? What is organizing? What does it mean to build power? I needed a book that could show me that all of the questions that I had, all of the experiences that I was having were actually shared experiences. They weren't isolated to just me, which would have given me more confidence, right, when I first started doing this work. And so for me, the whole goal of this book is to be a resource and breadcrumbs in the forest for people who are coming into social change. But it's also a way to sharpen an ongoing and existing practice for people who have been involved in social change for a long time. And I hope that people who are reading the book are really getting that out of it as well. One of the big lessons that I want to share without giving away everything in the book um, is that it's really important to remember that this work is hard. It's not intended to be easy. And I think sometimes when people come into this work, um, they have grand visions and ideas about what this is going to be like, right? We see all the fun stuff. We see the protests, right? We see all of the art and the creativity, but we often don't see the behind the scenes work and all of the work that goes into, massive protests that emerge all over the country. We don't see the work that goes into the sexy stuff. And so I want to tell people this work is hard. And the lesson here is that um, we can't let cynicism and despair shape the way that we do this work. We actually have to be guided by love. We have to be guided by a vision of what is possible. And our work, the reason that we do that hard work is to close the gap between what is and what can be. And that's just really got to be guided by a deep sense of love and commitment, even though the work is hard. So that's one lesson. And there are tons of other ones in the book that I think everybody will get something out of.
Yeah, I really love that you led with your own story, like your own personal story, because I think sometimes people are, they become overwhelmed with, oh, this is so much, but then they also think that, oh, this person just started that, like this whole influencer, trend that's happening right now. Like, oh, she did a hashtag and then she became, famous, this famous movement builder. But you have been doing this work way, much longer than just coming on the scene. And it wasn't about the hashtag, it was about your intentionality and your love for Black people, where you wrote that statement on Twitter. I love you. Our lives matter. And so I think that um, it, I think the space that we're in right now and where folks are in the message that is echoing is that it's not about being this like super activist, right? It's about, where you are, finding your place, right? Standing on your square and then doing what you can do with what you have and where you are. So I really appreciated that it was of the personal story and not, just all of Black Lives Matter, but all of your experiences. Um, why the title though, Power? What how did you land on that title, Purpose of Power? And especially that how we, I mean, it's so appropriate for right now, but I mean, was that it, or was it something that was happening? Because you started the book before,
That's right.
the uprisings of 2020. So how did you land on that title?
Well, interestingly, when I finally finished the manuscript uh, in 2020, early 2020, I was talking with a friend of mine, Angela Rye, who some of you might know. She and I were going back and forth, and I said, I'm really trying to come up with a title for this book. Now, in our conversation, the whole reason that we got on the phone in the first place was that we started to discuss, right, what was at stake coming out of the primaries, the presidential primaries. And we were lamenting about the fact that we lost a really big opportunity in 2020 to have a progressive candidate for president. And a lot of what that came down to, right, was that we were organizing ourselves around who was the farthest left, as opposed to organizing ourselves to take power. We needed one of them, right? And it doesn't,
Right.
like, the nuances between them actually were not important. What was the most important was that we had somebody who was progressive, who was going to challenge corporations, who was going to challenge big capital, right? To expand opportunities and to expand access for people who are being left out and left behind every single day. And we missed that opportunity. And the reason I think we missed that opportunity is because part of what we forget in our work is not that we are trying to find the people who already agree with us, right? We are trying to build power. And I think sometimes in social change work, we focus on things like being with people who agree with us. We focus on things like being with people who want the same things and do things the same way that we do. But that's not actually building power. Building power is about making the rules and shaping the rules. Building power is about deciding what the agenda is that people who represent us are trying to implement, and what happens to them when they refuse or fail, right, to move that agenda in a satisfactory way. Power is about who controls the story of who we are and who we can be together. Power is about where resources go and where they don't go and why. And all of that should shape our activities and our actions when we are organizing and when we are working for social change. It's not about building cliques, and it's not about finding bigger and bigger groups of people who already agree with you. It's actually about expanding our ranks, right? And looking for the people who are looking for us, but right now don't have a political home. There are people all over this country who want better healthcare, who want to make sure that they're not getting evicted or their houses aren't being foreclosed on. There are people all over this country who want to make sure that our schools are quality, who want to make sure that kids get to be kids and that they get to make mistakes, right? And that all kids get to make mistakes, not just some.
Right.
And yet, unfortunately, sometimes the character of our movement can be so comfortable, right, in the people who already get it, that we forget that building power, right, is also about building majorities. And there are a ton of people who are not organized right now. So the title of this book, The Purpose of Power, really comes from wanting to make that connection between social change and building power. And I think a lot of us, let me say it this way, what I've experienced in 20 years of organizing is that understandings of power and how we build it are actually really elusive. There's not a lot of understanding about the difference between power and empowerment. And a lot of us are operating from a framework of empowerment rather than power building. So I hope that what people get from this book is some information about that, and perhaps a new way of looking at how it is that we create the change that we long for and that we deserve.
Yeah, yeah. I love that you say we're not building cliques, right? Like we don't always have to agree. And you give an example on that in your book where you talk about the how the right was so successful, right? In getting Trump into office ultimately. And you say that you have a quote in here from the book. You said, what's important to understand about the right as it evolved in this period is that it's a coalition of factions with distinct concerns, viewpoints, long-term and short-term visions and ideologies. They come together on things they can agree on in the interest of building and maintaining power. This has been key to the right's success and its survival. And that thing that they came around was their shared disdain, right, for communism and liberalism, you're right. And so in the communities that I've been a part of in my hometown, Detroit, there's a saying that, we're not going to always get along, right? We're not going to always think the same thing. There may be 10 things on this agenda. And if there's just the one that we agree on, let's work to move that forward. And you pointed, and there's more than one because you just named a list of them, right? With housing and healthcare and just just poverty overall. There's climate justice. There are a lot of things that I'm sure that we can agree on. So let's focus on those things. What can we learn from that? Right, that being able, I mean, you touched on it a little bit, but from our own failures and mistakes and ideas of what that is, like, you've even had your own experiences, right, of, I don't want to say but conflict, right? Like, how do you move past that to focus on what is most important?
Well, first of all, shout out to Detroit. And for any Detroiter that's watching right now, what up, though?
What up, though?
I also want to say that Detroit has taught me so much about this very point. And in a lot of ways, what I wanted to get across here is, we don't have the luxury of cutting people away, right? When there's so much at stake for us and the crises are so big. One of the reasons that Detroit organizing is so impactful and powerful is that, frankly, Detroiters have been fighting an uphill battle against corporate power, against corruption, for decades. And there wasn't a choice to say, well, we're not going to work with these people and we're not going to work with these people because, look, there's no water and people are poor,
right,
and people can't eat. And so we don't have the luxury of cutting people off that basically want the same things we do when we're up against these giants that really want to make sure that we don't get the things that we need to live well.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I think is important about this conversation about the right is not us learning how to be like them. In fact,
Right.
What makes us lovely, right, is that we are really rooted in a love for humanity. We are really rooted in a sense of dignity and integrity, and they are not. So we don't want to replicate what they do, but we can certainly learn from how it is that they've built the most powerful movement in this country over the last 40 years. And the way that they've done that is to get clear about what it is that they're actually fighting for. They have multiple factions that don't get along. In this last 4 years, we saw all of the ways in which, the emergence of Donald Trump actually set those factions afire, right? Some of them were like, this guy's a complete idiot and we can't have him be the leader of the party, of the opposition. And then others of them were like, look, you better get clear about this. Like, he's actually moving a lot of people and we need to get behind him. Sure, I don't agree with all of the nutso things that he's saying, but it doesn't matter. He can have power, and therefore our agenda can have power.
Right.
So part of what I want to encourage us to think about, to ground ourselves in, right, is what do we actually need to accomplish things together? And who do we need to be to accomplish things together? Is it fundamentally necessary that we agree on every piece of language, every tactic, every possible strategy? Or is it necessary that we create the kinds of containers, the kinds of vehicles that can hold a bunch of things at once while moving in the same direction? What we know is that the Tea Party and the evangelical right and the racist right, they have different approaches, different tactics, different strategies, but they all are focused on power. And so where they come together and how they diverge from one another is still very much focused on how do we get to the end goal. The evangelicals don't want to do the same things that the racist right is doing, but they also kind of know they need each other to be successful. So they figure it out, right?
Right.
And so that's something that I think we can really learn from. We have such a breadth and a depth of strategies and tactics and experiences and approaches and methods that actually should be much more generative than I think we allow space for. And as a result, even when we're looking at the current infrastructure negotiations, you can't see this from where I am right now, but directly in front of me, I have CNN, and there's a big a picture of Steve Bannon right now. That's scary.
No, yeah.
In these conversations about infrastructure, right, one of the things that we can see very clearly is how these factions are organizing and aligning themselves. And we can also see what happens when different strategies and approaches, when under the same umbrella and coordinated, can actually complement each other and help move the agenda forward. How would we be at this part of the conversation if there weren't activists and organizers who are bird dogging Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, while at the same time there are legislators and policymakers and policy advocates, right, who are pushing from a different perspective. You
Yeah.
actually need all of it in order to be successful. So that's what I'm trying to get to there. And that is what
Yeah.
I'm trying to inspire us to think bigger about. Not how we can
Yeah.
be the right, but how we
Right.
can use the lessons of how they've built power to build our own.
Yeah. And it's unfortunate sometimes that it seems like on this the left, and I use that term loosely because there are a lot of folks in black communities who don't refer to themselves as progressives or liberals
That's
or
okay.
any or the left or any of that.
Most of us.
However,
Most of us.
we all
Yeah.
most of right, but we all still but we're fighting for the same thing though, right?
Right.
And sometimes a lot of our actions that we do take are reactionary, right? Like so last year with the uprisings, right? And with COVID and with the voting restrictions after the general election, all these things is what then put people who are not used to fighting or are not used to activism or are not used to using their voice to be out and about to say, okay, now there's a problem, right? So we tend to do that. And so we do have more people who are now responding to the problem. What does that mean? Do you think that means for, and maybe they're not joining movements, but maybe they're doing something in their own spaces, but I would say that that's a plus. That's something. And then how do they keep going, right? And not stop like this year because it's like, oh, that happened last year. We were in the streets for months. And I know you weren't a part of any of that organizing, but just the fact that people were responding, right? And so now no, there's not been any national attention being drawn to people who are still being killed by police, right? And so folks some of them are going back to business as usual. But what does it mean that we had that groundswell of just like millions of people out around the world, right? And how do we sustain that?
Well, it means a few things. Number one, it means that more and more people are being impacted by the crises that organize our world right now. And more people are feeling that. It also means that we have done incredible work over the last decade to break through, to push through from being only known in our own circles, right, to shifting a global conversation about race, racism, and structural inequity. That's important. But it also tells us a little bit about how our movements can grow and change. Um, this conversation about Black communities is so dear to my heart because that's the work I do every day. And people are shocked when I say I never use the word progressive when I'm talking to other Black folks. I never use the word left. And it's not because I'm not a leftist and it's not because I'm not a progressive. It's because our communities, just in the same way that we've been left out and left behind from government and governance, we've also been left out and left behind from progressive movements. And that is both about the imperfections of human beings that are trying to do things that don't, and trying to live in a world that doesn't exist right now. And it's also a little bit about laziness. So I think it's important for us to just acknowledge, right, that our movements need to adapt to ensure that people don't get left out and left behind. That's one. But the second thing I think it shows us is that it's never been enough. It's never been enough just to fight unjust systems. It always has to be complemented by a clear and coherent vision for what we want instead. And, in every kind of moment of uprising, you are always going to have attrition. That's just a fact. And I think sometimes people get really disheartened because we see a bunch of people in the streets and then we're like, well, how come people aren't taking more action? Well, to be honest, right, not everybody is clear about what action they can take besides getting into the streets. And number two, there's just a reality that for a lot of folks, right, if there's not a place for them to be absorbed into, yes, they're going to go back to exactly what they were doing before.
Right.
So that's a conversation for us about our infrastructure. Like, where are the places that we are plugging people into where they can take action on the things that are most meaningful for them? It's
Yeah.
exactly why I created the Black Futures Lab and the Black to the Future Action Fund, because we work to make Black communities powerful in politics so we can be powerful in the rest of our lives. And one of the gaps that we're trying to address here is that our organizing infrastructure um, isn't 21st century ready. And so we
Mm.
need to make sure there are multiple places where people can take a range of actions on the things that they care about, and that they feel and experience that the action that they take actually has some kind of impact. So that's something that I think we need to be paying attention to. And then lastly, I will just say that one thing that I think is also deeply important is to remind ourselves and each other that it's never just been protest that has brought about change. And this is
Right.
a narrative question that I think we really have to dig deep into. I too was raised with all of the stories about the last period of civil rights um, that were ahistorical. They were fairy tales, essentially. I mean, we got taught that Rosa Parks, she was just a seamstress who was too tired to move to the back of the bus, and
Right.
that kicked off, a 384-day bus boycott in Montgomery,
Right.
Alabama, when actually Rosa Parks was a seasoned
Right.
organizer.
Right. Right.
I, we got taught that, there were superheroes who basically fell from the sky, like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, right? Who showed up and automatically were positioned to lead a community, and that's just not the truth. And as long as we learn those stories in that way, it's also how we understand how change happens, and it does a
Mm-hmm.
huge disservice to us seeing our own agency and power as change makers and as people who can be change agents.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, this book is really about how can each of us find our potential of being a change maker? How do we
Yeah.
better understand what change making means? And how do we find our appropriate contribution? Not everybody, and in fact, not many people will ever find themselves behind a podium addressing tens of thousands of
Right.
people. But that's not what's required to make change. And so hopefully through reading this book, you get a better understanding of what is required and what your particular role could be.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Um, we don't have a whole lot of time left, but I do want you to talk about the work you're doing at Future Labs, because you know you have this theme of voting as a movement, right? That is picking up, but can you talk more about what that's like, and what the expectation is from um, Black folks, of course, but others who can support in that work that you all are doing who are not Black. Um, so if you could
Yeah.
just kind of talk about that a little bit.
Absolutely. Well, you can learn a lot about us at blackfutureslab.org. And our work is really about making Black communities powerful in politics so we can be powerful in the rest of our lives. Here's what that looks like. We collect recent and relevant data about who Black communities are, what we experience every day, and what we want to see for our futures. And we use that data, we use those stories to change the narrative about who Black people are and what we want and what we deserve. But we also use that data to impact and shape good public policy that is race forward, not race neutral, that holds government accountable and responsible for meeting the needs of its subjects and its citizens. And then also that moves a progressive agenda and that fully roots a progressive agenda in the needs of our communities. We don't pretend, right, that there's anything that the conservative movement has to offer Black communities. And
Right.
that's a
Right.
new conversation in the world. We
Hmm.
also motivate, mobilize, educate, and activate Black voters across the country. And in fact, in 2020, during our first ever field program, we were able to talk to over 1 million Black voters on our C3 side and 1 million Black voters on our C4 side. And what that tells me, right, is that there are lots of people out there who need to be and want to be engaged, not just when we need something from them, but all year round. It's
Right.
important to ensure that our communities are a critical and integral part of every decision that is being made about us right now without us. The other thing that we do is we build the capacity of our communities to be powerful and win. And in fact, just last month, we launched our second annual Black to the Future Public Policy Institute, where we're training Black people from Black communities how to write, win, and implement new rules in cities and states. And what that looks like, for example, is supporting organizations like the Young Women's Freedom Center, um, which has a bill on the governor's desk right now that they helped to design in our institute last year, that changes the sentencing guidelines for people who have committed crimes and they have domestic violence or intimate partner violence in their backgrounds, right?
Hmm.
And what that's going to mean, right, is that families will stay together. It's going to mean that communities stay a little bit more intact. But if we don't have the tools of public policy in our hands, those tools are often and can often be used against us. So that's a little bit of the work that we do at the Black Futures Lab. We also partner with Black grassroots organizations across the country to ensure that they have the tools and the infrastructure they need to be strong so that our communities can be strong. And that means that we train folks how to build their organizations, how to grow their organizations. And we try to make sure, right, that those organizations are strong and equipped to be able to be in this fight of our lifetimes. So that's a little bit about the work that we do. And if you want to learn more about us, again, please visit blackfutureslab.org. We believe that voting is important, but it's not the only tool that we need to use to be powerful. But we also believe, right, that a lot of the reason that people come in and out of being engaged in our democracy is because democracy is not working as hard for us as we are working for it.
For it.
And we have
Yeah.
to change that equation in order to be powerful.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alicia. We do have some questions that I want to get in because I know we don't have much more time. Lori wants to know, how can you measure impact to know if you're making any?
Mm. Well, it's about how our communities talk about our presence, our work, and our impact. So it's not just a one-way conversation, right? We hear from people all the time about how we're shaping their lives and their perspectives. The other way that you can measure impact is by participation, and it's important, I think, to be checking for, is this a valuable resource for Black communities? How do we know? Do Black folks show up?
Right, right.
So that's some of the way I think we can measure that.
All right. Natalie wants to know if you can speak to the difference between online and offline organizing, and how do we bring people from online to in person, and how do
Mm.
they complement each other?
Oh, yeah. Well, they can complement each other when used together well, and when intentional. Online organizing often involves engaging people's online profiles, right, to take action on a thing. Usually, we ask people to do things like sign a petition. We ask people to do things like share some information with 10 of their friends. And then, of course, offline organizing can look a whole range of ways, but it's really all about building relationships so that we can take collective action together. And that can also be true of digital organizing, but it requires a strategy, just like offline organizing requires a strategy. And the best way to combine online and offline organizing is to create community on both sides, and give people concrete actions to take that don't just land in one place or the other. I'm not somebody who wants to kind of engage in the is one better than the other one. Instead, I want us to talk about how we can be creative in using both to complement each other so that we can get closer to where we want to be. I think Black Lives Matter is a really good example of how we've brought people together online to take action together offline. But we're not the only ones, and we're not the first ones to do it. Organizations like Color of Change do this very thing, and they do it at scale. They have, I want to say they have more than 7 million members online.
I think the number is 8. I think when I spoke to someone over there, they said like around 8 million. Yeah.
Excellent. And that's because they are being creative and combining online and offline strategies. Yes, they mobilize people online, but they also bring people together in community offline. And I've been very lucky to be a part of things like their Black women's brunches, right? That they've held across the country, bringing people that don't know each other together to share a meal and take action. They also have incredible work that they're doing with squads around the country who are leading excellent policy campaigns that are changing the rules in cities and states across the nation. So those are some good examples of how those things can come together well.
Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts and feelings about bioregional governance as a way to transcend the nationalistic issue?
That's a little bit outside of my wheelhouse, but
Okay.
I'm gonna look into more about bioregional governance, and I'll circle back to
Okay.
you.
Okay, no problem. Um, there, so with folks coming out and just wanting, because I do have one more question from the audience, but I want to end on that one because it's more of an uplifting, positive question. This one is more to some of the unhelpfulness that is happening in movement building and organizing and harm being done. And if you can just speak to an example of something that you've witnessed rather, or have experienced that folks are doing that they cannot do. It's like, don't do this, do that. Like, this is these actions that you're like, I know you want to help, right? I know you want to do this, but just some of those things of, because I think when people, they get like kind of overzealous and they want to be a part of the thing and they don't really know how. And so how do you show up without knowing so that you're not causing harm?
I think showing up with curiosity and showing up being ready to follow is important. As somebody who's been a part of movements for at least 20 years now, what I can say is that I really like being in the back. There's something really wonderful about following somebody else's leadership. And really helping to support other people to be leaders. And sometimes our leadership is not called for, our participation is called for. Sometimes our leadership is called for, and it's really a question of being able to strike the balance and know the difference. And I think that one mistake people make often is that they get so excited about being a part of this movement, but they think that their entry point is to be the leader, the decision maker, the strategy designer. And actually, it's important to be curious when you come into something, knowing that you're not the first one who ever thought about a thing.
Right.
There are lots of people
Right.
Who need you. They need your hands, they need your brain, they need your talents and your skills. And sometimes it's important to just take the time to learn about what's been done so that you can contribute in the most helpful, effective, and impactful way.
Yeah. Wow, Alicia, 20 years is, some folks have been doing it for 30, 40, 50 plus, and I get that, but still within our, right, but 20 years is still a long time. 20 years is still a long time. So how do you, with all the other experience, like all the experiences, of course, are not positive ones, not just from folks outside and who don't agree, but even from within. How do you keep love at the center of what you do? Because that's kind of how you started. Right. So how do you keep that at the center of what it is that you do?
I think honestly, it's about having compassion for myself and other people. That's the answer that I'm going to give today. Okay. I'm not always loving. I don't always feel loving towards this movement. And I'll tell you, the last decade in particular, I think has been really hard.
Yes.
And
yes.
With that, right? What experience brings you and time brings you is more space for opening. And what I recognize is, again, that we are trying to accomplish things, and we have accomplished things that have not been done before. And in that, the messiness of what it means to be human in there is going to come all the way out. And I'm
Yeah,
actually
yeah,
more grateful for that than I am bitter about it.
yeah.
So, where my love comes from, right, is being able to be compassionate for myself and for others who are attempting to do extraordinary things as ordinary people.
Thank you so much, Alicia, and much gratitude to you for joining us today. That is all the time that we have, everyone. You take care and be well, and looking forward to your next book.
Thank you. Much love to y'all.
All
Thanks
right,
for having me.
bye.